Contemplating Pain and Suffering, Vivienne Legg.
Even the wisest human being experiences joy and pain, but he or she perceives all manifestations of these, as with all other forms, in their natural and original state, without allowing himself or herself to be uncontrollably overpowered by them. This is in contrast to the usual, unwise human being who accepts or rejects everything instinctively, whereby attachment or aversion is characteristic of him/her, which leads to the accumulation of negative thought and feelings as well as to unequalized reactions unto emotions. No. 472, The Way to Life.
In his texts, Billy discusses the erroneous attitudes about pain and difficulty that the Earth human being has, including how we tend to regard death and even life itself, including its striving, as suffering. Of course, many see suffering as deserved punishment from a god. The Buddhist teaching meanwhile stresses how we should free ourselves from suffering altogether by transcending it. But Billy explains that this is the wrong way. Firstly, life and death and striving are not themselves suffering, and secondly, suffering that occurs in our lives provides necessary learning, and we must have difficulty and pain in order to progress on our evolutionary path. However, we need to be aware that, as is taught in the book, might of the thoughts, negative states of the psyche, triggered by difficulty and pain, are caused by our own thought.
The circumstances from which suffering lead, a negative state of the psyche grows in the human being are the product of the might of his or her thoughts and are thereby also the product of his or her own mental disharmony, which is expressed through his or her thoughts and feeling. Chapter 10.
So, how are we supposed to understand concepts such as suffering and affliction and pain? As I read Billy's texts, such as might of the thoughts and the way to life, I find myself confused by the terms in sections of the teaching about learning to overcome suffering and pain, or referring to the ongoing pain and negative occurrences experienced by a wise human being. I get lost in an attempt to work out the difference between schema's pain and lead, which has been typically but incorrectly translated as suffering, which can misleadingly imply a negative physical state. I puzzle over the differing statements about them. For instance, Billy says it is irrational to think of the pain of birth as lead, which we translated as suffering, but he also says that the human being must remain viable in order to be able to be befallen by pain and lead, because this is a section on the way of progress. Here it is important to clarify that Billy has in recent years explained that lead is a psychical moral negative state and leiden are an understanding and misunderstanding and so forth which affect the moral and psyche, and these terms should actually not be translated as suffering or affliction, which pertain more to the physical body. I do find that if I replace uses of suffering and affliction throughout those texts where they correspond to leiden and lead with those above descriptions, the meaning does usually become clear. But it doesn't always work. I think the trick is not to get too bogged down by those terms, because none can describe it all perfectly. Rather, it is important to study and contemplate each relevant explanation thoroughly and of course notice how it really is in one's own life. The following excerpt from the book Goblet of the Truth further addresses that which for me is the most clarifying teaching about this.
133 Also, while learning the real truth, joy and affliction are permanent companions, but you humankind of earth, you shall not let yourselves be saddened through the affliction lead, and shall not fall into overcourage through the joy, because you shall use joy and affliction to shake up and encourage yourselves to really awaken in your consciousness as well as in your thoughts and feeling. 134 And if you do so, you will be freed from all daily nothingnesses, and thus you feel in the joy and also in the affliction as well as in the well-being and in the pain, the well-doing connection with the energy and power of the creation and all its love, which streams through everything living, also you humankind of earth. p. 443.
So it seems that pain teaches us what life is, and it is not something to try to be totally without. Because of this, it is recommended that we never remain pain-free and inviolable. During an occurrence of pain, we can turn our attention to the bigger picture. Once again, it means paying full attention to what is behind it and not being driven by our prejudices, beliefs, and negative thought patterns. This paying attention replaces being distracted by anxieties and other learned reactions concerning the pain. Logically, a neutral observing and perceiving of the pain will bring us closer to seeing and understanding it in its natural state and no longer as an imposition or punishment. Might of the thoughts tells us that
when an instance of suffering laden is nourished with negative thought, then it grows beyond measure and brings harm, affliction, and misery. But when an instance of suffering laden is approached with positive, good, fostering and constructive thoughts, then the suffering laden is reduced and becomes the evolutive factor. p. 53.
clearly, pain in its true state, seen positive and neutrally, is just a natural part of our existence. That would seem obvious if we consider the natural world in which animals in nature obviously have to deal with pain and lading, according to Billy, in everyday life, and nonetheless they have not been confused by irrational, illogical religious teachings which distract us earth human beings from viewing our existence as it truly is. Where the human being is concerned, the way to life tells us
495. If the consciousness remains open during all practical and living experience, it can find the actual truth, which is hidden behind everything. Thus also the pain can become the teaching if the truth behind the suffering lead is fathom. Therefore pain can become the best ally on one's lifelong way on the search for knowledge, love, wisdom and harmony.
That section further clarifies that pain can bring
a progressive gift: cognition, cognizance, knowledge, practical experience, living experience, wisdom, love, peace and harmony. Regardless of how despairing one may be in pain and suffering, it must all be accepted as it is, in order to learn from it and to overcome it so that one is not suffocated by it and is not psychically ruined.
It should be remembered in the context of all this that there are times when we must focus on something other than our pain, in order to find a neutral positive state of mind to deal with it, so that all the negative things don't have an overburdening effect. We have to steer our minds sometimes onto something neutral. To what extent then should we focus on our pains, troubles and difficulties, given that we need to pay thorough attention to them in order to learn as part of our reality? How much attention is too much? Well, it seems to me the answer is simply that in order not to actually be defeated by the negatives, we must turn away from them sometimes. But if we are able to regard them without being overcome thanks to having achieved a more neutral basis of thoughts and feelings, then we can turn our attention to scrutinizing them once again, and by, like the wise human being, we can gradually come to understand and recognize all manifestations of joy and pain in their natural and original state.